आते हैं उनके पास किताबें होती हैं। अब जो बहुत अच्छा शुरू से ही पढ़ा है, लेकिन जो बच्चा गांव में पढ़ता है, सब्जी बेचता है, बेच के पढ़ा है, जिसके पिताजी रिक्शा ठेला चला रहे हैं, उसको ट्रेनिंग तो एकदम जरूरी है।
Anand Kumar's brother Pranav is the manager of Super 30. Competition for the school is so intense that the candidates bring photo IDs. Imposters have been known to sit the exam.
क्वेश्चन पेपर चेक कर लीजिए, कोई मिसप्रिंटिंग है, पेपर नहीं है, उसमें क्वेश्चन गाइड है, गड़बड़ हो तो अभी ही बदल लीजिए। उसके बाद नाम और रोल नंबर, सीट नंबर लिखिए। फाइनल राउंड का टेस्ट हो रहा है, इसी में नंबर के आधार पर होगा और सेकेंडरी उसको हम लोग उसका देखते हैं, फाइनेंशियल बैकग्राउंड देखते हैं और दोनों को देख के हम लोग फाइनल लिस्ट बनाते हैं। लोअर इनकम के लिए प्राथमिकता दी जाती है। यदि उस
सब यहीं पर गुजर गया। यही जन्म धरती जो बोलता है ना, वही मकान मेरा शुरू से आ रहा है। यहीं पर बढ़ते 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 छोटा हो गया। किताब पूरा बहुत बड़ा था, सब परिवार इसी में थे, बढ़ते बढ़ते हो गया कम।
The family is divided. Satyendra is here with his mother. His wife lives mostly in her own village. Her family is better off, while Satyendra often struggles to survive.
परिस्थिति गंभीर हो गया और का। यहाँ पर हर साल धान होता रोपाता है, दह जाता है, देख रहे हैं ना सब खंडा पड़ती। यही परिस्थिति है यहाँ के, सब खत्म हो जाता है कभी कभी। खाने पीने पढ़ने लिखने में खत्म। इधर उधर कोई साल अगर घटा तो इधर उधर से पैंचा उधर की है, नहीं घटा तो पूरा हो गया।
But Satyendra's circumstances could soon improve. His hopes are invested in his son Alok. He's been studying in Patna and has just been accepted for Super 30.
हम सुपर 30 में सेलेक्ट हो गए। हम सोचे कि 300, हम पहले नहीं जानते थे कि मेंस का भी होगा। फिर बोला कि एक और टेस्ट होगा, हम सोचे कि होगा। उसके बाद टेस्ट उसका भी दिए। बस मम्मी पापा से कहें तो कहें कि करो, पैसा देंगे।
Like most village children, Alok spent his entire life speaking Hindi. Since moving to Patna, he's had to study in English.
हिंदी मीडियम होने से पहले कुछ दिन तक समझ में नहीं आता है। क्लास में पीछे आराम से बैठते थे पहले, उसके बाद धीरे धीरे समझ में आने लगा तो अच्छा लगता है।
लड़का लड़का नहीं कि कोई इधर जाके पिए, शराब पिए तो सिनेमा देखे, ये सब उसके पास। यहाँ पूंजी नहीं है, कहाँ से मिलेगा? अब मिलेगा तो पढ़ेगा कैसे? जब वो रहता तो घर के बुरा देता।
These days, Alok only rarely goes home. His road to the future leads away from the village.
कभी कभी जाते थे तो पिताजी के साथ काम भी करते थे। अभी भी लगता है कि ठीक है वही। फिर लगता है कि यहाँ आने पे मेहनत भी ज़्यादा करेंगे और रिजल्ट भी अच्छा होगा।
अभी तो नहीं बेचे हैं कुछ उसके पढ़ाने के लिए, लेकिन अब जरूरत पड़ेगा तो बिकेगा नहीं। जमीन है जो काहे के लिए रहेगी? एक कट्ठा लड़के हैं तो चाहे जमीन में रखे, चाहे लड़का को देखे।
Hindus in Bihar still live in a hierarchy of castes. Many have the jobs traditionally associated with their caste, like the dhobis or washermen who do Patna's laundry. They're among the lowest groups, known as the scheduled castes.
मैं अनुसूचित जाति से मतलब मैं आता हूँ और जाति के मैं मतलब पासी हूँ, जो हमारे मतलब कि पूर्वज बहुत ही यानी दयनीय स्थिति, बहुत पुअर मतलब कि फैमिली।
But birth is no longer destiny, even in Bihar. Education is often the key. This family is still poor, but they're on the way up. Jyotish is the youngest of 3 sons. Like Alok, he's taken Anand's classes and has been accepted for Super 30. Even so, it's not easy.
मेरा बच्चा मतलब 30 निकाले हैं तो ये ऐसे, और मेरे बच्चे भी शिक्षा से मतलब बहुत ही उसके प्रति मैं जागरूक हूँ। इनका भी मतलब अच्छा मतलब इंजीनियरिंग करें तो उस पर इन्वेस्टमेंट हो रहे हैं, तो उसको मतलब एक मतलब सिंपल से गवर्नमेंट वेतन सैलरी से मतलब ये पॉसिबल नहीं हो सकते हैं।
The family had to borrow money, even to pay the low fees of the Ramanujan school.
तो हम डाल चुके हैं, रात में तय किए हैं कुछ सामान, आज कपड़ा और कभी तो आज भी कुछ खा के जाते हैं।
Today, the students are making their way to the Ramanujan school. Those coming from remote villages may have to travel for days. Jyotish's journey is only across Patna, but it'll take him into a different world.
पहले तो कभी सोच ही नहीं थे कि हमें यहाँ सुपर 30 में होगा और इतना दिन रहना पड़ेगा अलग घर से। अब तो रहना तो जरूरी है, मजबूरी में भी रहेंगे।
The rooms are basic, but cost the boys nothing. This is where Jyotish will spend much of the next 7 months. Like the accommodation, food is also free for the Super 30. Each has 2 tiffin boxes, the typically Indian containers in which they'll be given their meals.
आपको यहाँ 2 टिफ़िन रखना पड़ेगा, एक 12 बजे आप यहाँ खाना ले जाइएगा और एक रात में ले जाइएगा। और टेस्ट यहाँ लगभग 10 दिन बाद से शुरू होगा, अभी तो पढ़ाई शुरू हो रही है। और हॉस्टल में कोई दिक्कत हो खाने रहने में तो ये धीरज जी हैं, इनसे बताइएगा, ठीक? मन लगा के पढ़िए।
मेन सुपर 30 का जो मुख्य उद्देश्य है, मेरा मेन थीम है मेरा, वो ये है कि अपने दर्द को जो हमने देखा है, जो फील किया है, गरीबी के चलते आगे मैंने पढ़ाई नहीं कर पाई है, वहाँ से इस सोर्स ऑफ इंस्पिरेशन मुझे मिलता है।
Sushila, meanwhile, has been waitlisted for Super 30. She didn't do quite well enough in the second exam.
फ़ोन करके पूछी तो बोले कि नहीं आपका सिलेक्शन नहीं हुआ है, तो वो थोड़ा सा डिप्रेस, फिर सोचे कि नहीं यही लिमिट नहीं है। फिर पापा को बोले तो पापा बोले कि अरे कैसे नहीं हुआ, कि वो तुम्हारे मतलब एलिजिबिलिटी तो है तुम्हारी उस तरह की।
She's taking Anand's classes and still hopes to get in. If she fails, this may be the end of her education.
पहले पापा ये रखे थे कि सुपर 30 में अगर सिलेक्शन हो जाता है तो तुम यहाँ पे फिर रहना, और फिर नहीं होगा तो वहाँ पे लौट जाने के लिए। तो मैंने मतलब मुझे ये नहीं लग रहा था कि मैं सुपर 30 नहीं हूँ, मुझे लगा कि नहीं अब मतलब घर जाऊँगी तो पढ़ाई डिसकंटिन्यू हो जाएगी, मतलब मेन ये था मेरा। तो मैंने पापा से कहा नहीं पापा, मतलब हम यहीं पर रह के पढ़ेंगे।
Bihar is a deeply conservative society. It isn't easy to change people's attitudes.
लड़की होना कोई कर्ज थोड़े ना कि मैं एक लड़की होंगी तो मुझे खराब लगेगा, मुझे तो और अच्छा लगेगा कि हाँ चलो मैंने लड़कियों को रिप्रेजेंट किया।
The Kumar brothers also want to help those coming from the scheduled castes and will even discriminate in their favor.
ज्योतिष, आलोक, आजाद, ये लोग रिजर्वेशन से आए हैं ना, इन लोग को स्पेशल क्लास लगाना।
सुशीला भी लड़की बहुत गरीब है और उसकी भी स्थिति खराब है। हम लोग चाहते तो उससे बेटर लड़की हम लोगों के पास थी, लेकिन वो इकोनॉमिकली बहुत अच्छी थी, साउंड थी, इसलिए हम नहीं लेंगे। इसलिए हम लोग पूरा जोर लगाएंगे, पूरा दम लगा देंगे।
As a boy, Anand Kumar was a mathematical prodigy. He was accepted for a PhD at Cambridge, but couldn't afford to study in England. He set up the Ramanujan School and then Super 30 to give other gifted children a better chance.
एक तरह से देखा जाए तो मैं अपना कैरियर को मैथमेटिक्स में ही परस्यू कर रहा हूँ, लेकिन बात दूसरा है कि बहुत ही बड़ा रिसर्च स्कॉलर के तौर पर नहीं कर पा रहा हूँ। कारण उसका स्पष्ट है कि पैसे के अभाव में मैं कैम्ब्रिज नहीं जा पाया, ये मेन रीज़न था। लेकिन उसके लिए कोई चिंता की बात नहीं है। मैं यहीं पर आगे धीरे धीरे इस स्थिति में लाना चाहता हूँ अपने आप को कि यहाँ ही बहुत अच्छा माहौल पैदा करूँ। There is no words to describe the pleasure of mathematics. It is feeling. तो आप फील कर सकते हो उसको बना के, महसूस करके। बहुत अच्छा लगता है इसको जब ये खोज होता है कोई, जब मैं कोई नया सवाल बनाता हूँ और सवाल बड़ा पेचीदा होता है, लेकिन बहुत मशक्क़त के बाद धीरे धीरे सवाल जब बन जाता है तो मज़ा आ जाता है।
Today is Republic Day, a major event in India's national calendar. Abhay Anand is the second most senior police officer in Bihar. He's on his way to the parade ground here in Patna.
Every state capital we have ceremonial parade. It's a very important day for the entire country, which includes policemen.
mobile displays show off aspects of life in Bihar. Today is also the festival of Saraswati, the Hindu goddess of learning. As a teacher, Anand Kumar has come to pay his respects. It's a public holiday, so all India's schools are closed, except the Ramanujan school, where it's a day like any other. The parade's now over, and Abhayanand switched his role as well as his uniform. Because this top cop spends his free time teaching physics to the Super 30.
Strengths have to be sustained. Weaknesses have to be identified and strengthened.
Abhayanand joined the school shortly after it was founded by Anand Kumar.
रामानुजन स्कूल ऑफ मैथमेटिक्स का ये जो फिगर ये पहला हम लोगों का अपने स्टूडेंट लाइफ में जब हम लोग चलाते थे उस जमाने का है। धीरे धीरे कार्यक्रम का विस्तार होता गया। अभयानंद जी फिजिक्स पढ़ाने के लिए तैयार हुए। वो बहुत ईमानदार ऑफिसर बिहार में है, जाने जाते हैं, पूरे देश में एक ईमानदार ऑफिसर के रूप में जाने जाते हैं। बहुत व्यस्त रहते हैं। उन व्यस्तताओं के बावजूद भी कठिन टाइम में भी उस समय निकाल के आते हैं, बच्चों को पढ़ाते भी हैं और साथ साथ उत्साह भी बढ़ाते हैं।
Abhayanand's day job makes him responsible for 90,000 policemen. He comes from one of Bihar's best-known upper caste families. They have a long tradition of public service.
I wanted to give back. That's the main theme. And all my activities hover around that theme. I've got so much. And I have no qualms about not having had enough in life. I've had enough, I'm satisfied. I could have given back only things which I have. This is the best that I had.
Anand Kumar's background is very different. He still lives in the rough part of town where he grew up. He has a nice house, but he's protected by gates, a dog, and his bodyguards. With good reason, given the power of the Patna Mafia.
Kidnappings do take place, at times murders due to jealous reasons, somewhat peculiar to this region. It does take place, it does happen, you get calls, security concerns cannot be ignored.
The slums of Manila, home to an extraordinary community. On the front line, Remy, a self-taught midwife, delivering new life into some of the toughest living conditions in the world. In a unique 6-part series, Al Jazeera follows the lives of the remarkable people who work, love and thrive in the slum on Al Jazeera.
I've worked at Al Jazeera English since its launch as a principal presenter and as a correspondent. With any breaking news story, we want to hear from those people who would normally not get their voices heard on an international news channel. One moment I'll be very proud of was when we covered the Nepal earthquake of 2015, a terrible natural disaster and a story that needed to be told from the heart of the affected area. To be there to tell the people's story was very important at the time.
Jump into the stream and join our global community.
This generation will have to create its own democracy with social media.
On air or online, be part of the debate.
Let me put some YouTube comments to you.
When no topic is off the table.
It's taking down all the systemic violence that people of color have suffered not only now but for decades.
We are going to need to transform the way we live, the way we consume, the way we do business if we're going to adapt to climate breakdown.
The stream on Al Jazeera.
13-year arms buying embargo on Iran is set to end as the US fails to get its way at the UN Security Council. Hello and welcome, I'm Peter Dobby. You're watching Al Jazeera live from our headquarters here in Doha. Also coming up, Washington says it's confiscated 4 shipments of Iranian fuel on their way to Venezuela, but Tehran says it knows nothing about them. Protesters in Belarus gather to remember a demonstrator killed during a rally against disputed presidential elections. And expressing deep remorse, Japan pledges never to repeat the tragedy of conflict as it marks 75 years since the end of the Second World War. Iran will be able to start buying conventional weapons again in October after the US failed to get a 13-year ban extended. Just one other nation backed it at a vote at the UN Security Council. Iran says the US has never been so isolated. However, the White House is threatening to find other ways to bring back sanctions. From New York, Kristen Salumi reports.
It was a quick and unceremonious end to the United States' efforts to extend the Iranian arms embargo.
The result of the voting is as follows: 2 votes in favor, 2 votes against. Number of votes.
In a statement, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo called it an inexcusable failure, saying, quote, "The Security Council paved the way for the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism to buy and sell conventional weapons without specific UN restrictions in place for the first time in over a decade." Under an agreement negotiated by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council and developing nuclear weapons, the 13-year-old ban on conventional in China, Cuba was the only other country to vote for it.
Well, it's a diplomatic catastrophe. It just demonstrates that President Trump and his team are not only bad at the strategy of approaching Iran, they're bad at just the day-to-day tactics of diplomacy. It is unconscionable that they couldn't round up more than 1 vote for a resolution like this.
The U.S. has threatened to trigger the return of all international sanctions on Iran through a snapback provision written into the nuclear deal. But other members of the Security Council say the U.S. lost the right to do that when it withdrew from the deal to Council if a legal dispute over snapback ensues. For them, preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon remains paramount. Kristen Salumi, Al Jazeera, United Nations.
The US Department of Justice says it seized Iranian fuel from 4 tankers headed for Venezuela. Both Iran and Venezuela are now under US sanctions. Here's Laura Burton-Manley.
The US is calling it the largest for Iran. It's intercepted 4 tankers carrying more than...
They're going to Houston, and they're there. They're not supposed to be doing that. Iran's not supposed to be doing that. And so we did. We seized the tankers, and we're moving them and moved to Houston.
But Iran says the Liberian flagged ships have nothing to do with them. It accuses the US of lies and psychological warfare.
No, right now there's nothing planned because we haven't had a request from our Venezuelan friends as they are reactivating their own refineries. US officials are experts in fabricating lies and carrying out shows in the media.
Turned off their tracking devices, seemingly not wanting to be found. But what's certain is that Trump is
negotiated with the owners, operators of those 4 tankers and arrange peaceably and agreeably for the transfer of the Iranian oil, refined oil, headed to Venezuela to other ships. Those ships are the ones that the president indicated have arrived in U.S. waters or are about to arrive in U.S. waters.
Venezuela has become increasingly more reliant on oil from Iran. It had previously received shipments in May and June. Although Venezuela sits on one of the world's largest crude oil reserves, it's unable to refine it. US sanctions, corruption and the lack of investment is blamed for the decline of its oil industry.
To date to actually seize the oil, but the United States has a policy of trying to drive Iranian oil exports to zero. They've frozen Iranian revenues from previous oil sales, so in effect that was confiscating it. And yes, this does ratchet it up another step.
Venezuela and Iran acted in defiance of US sanctions. For now, the seizure at sea appears to have stopped much-needed trade between the allies. Laura Burton-Manley, Al Jazeera.
The funeral of a man killed during protests in Belarus is about to begin. Let's take you live to that location. In the centre of Minsk, meanwhile, where it's just gone midday, large crowds are gathering at the site of his death for another day of demonstrations against the disputed presidential election. Step Assen is among the protesters. Step, just looking at these live pictures, it's difficult to know whether that's the memorial or the beginnings of a protest.
I think it's both. Thousands of people have gathered here in the last hour for the memorial of the 34-year-old man, Alexander Taraikovsky, who was killed here a couple of nights ago during the protest. A mountain of flowers is here behind me. People are bringing in flowers from everywhere. And they are also, they held a minute of silence, which was very impressive, all holding their hand in the air, showing a peace sign. Meanwhile, lots of cars are passing. How large these crowds have swollen in the last hour or so. There are thousands, maybe even tens of thousands here now, coming up on the street again for the seventh day in a row, protesting not only the amazing and violent police crackdown. We have heard stories of torture of thousands of detainees who have been taken off the streets in the last couple of nights, but also they're protesting the elections, which they call are rigged. They're asking for President Lukashenko to step down, and they're asking for new elections, but so far the government has not responded to any of their requests.
Are they planning any other protests in the days ahead?
Well, opposition candidate Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who is in Lithuania, she fled earlier in the week, has called on all her supporters to take part in peaceful demonstrations the whole weekend starting today all around Belarus. She has asked the mayors of all the cities and towns to organize these protests, so it will be more widespread than what you're seeing here. But looking at the turnout here today, it's promising to be a very, very tense but also very crowded weekend for Alexander Lukashenko.
Do you get the feeling there that as far as Mr. Lukashenko is concerned that he might be beginning to underestimate not so much the size of the demonstrations but the ability on the part of the protesters to keep it going?
Exactly. He has used the old tactic that he's been using for more than 20 years, which is a complete crackdown, repression. He was hoping probably that by scaring people, using violence, torturing them, he basically has traumatized thousands of detainees, very young people, maybe the age of 14, 15. A whole generation basically has been traumatized by the treatment by police in the last week. But all of this has not helped him. It actually has made the situation for Lukashenko worse, because people are now even more determined to go onto the streets. Even his loyal supporters are now joining these protests. So he has completely underestimated the situation, and he also has used old tactics that are not working in the 21st century anymore.
Okay, Step, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Step Vassana, correspondent there, reporting live from the middle of that demonstration, which will, we suspect, gather pace and momentum a little later today. Officials in Afghanistan, Kabul. She's part of a group representing Afghanistan in the forthcoming peace talks with the Taliban. protests to denounce the president's decision to seek a third term. Another day of demonstrations on Friday turned violent. Protesters accuse Alassane Ouattara of breaking a two-term limit, but he insists the new constitution allows him to run again. Ahmed Idris has more.
This is what remains of a police station in the southeastern town of Borwa, as opposition supporters clash with security forces. It's the latest in a series of demonstrations taking place across Ivory Coast for a third consecutive day. The protests threaten to plunge the country, once an island of stability, into its biggest political crisis since the Civil War of 2010. The contention is a declaration by President Alassane Ouattara to run again.
We are protesting for the President Ouattara to go because the Constitution has been violated, and we don't want to accept a third term. We call on the entire population of Ivory Coast to join us in making Ouattara leave.
Koulibaly suddenly died of a heart attack.
The risk cannot be. The fear of the country sinking into political and economic crisis has forced me to reconsider my earlier position not to run again. I accept the call by citizens who asked me to stand for president.
The opposition has warned that Ivory Coast cannot afford another bloody crisis.
We invite the President of the Republic to ensure that he can safeguard social peace and
Gbagbo, whose husband is still stuck in the Netherlands after his acquittal by the International Criminal Court of crimes against humanity, says providing a level playing field for all is the only thing that can stop the country sliding into anarchy.
I call on President Ouattara to make Laurent Gbagbo eligible to run and to free all held for the 2010 post-election violence. He should also facilitate the return of exile of thousands of Ivorians.
With tension building, some residents of the financial capital have started stocking up, fearing for the worst.
We still remember the events of 2010. I'm stocking up on supplies. Now look at the chicken we buy for 2,000 CFA. It's now 3,000 CFA. Even snail. Transport fares have gone up by 30%.
The president's supporters say a change to the constitution in 2016, which also drew violent demonstrations, clears the way for him to run again. Until 2010, Ivory Coast was considered one of Africa's most politically stable countries. Since then, it has seen violent demonstrations and even mutinies by soldiers. Presidential elections set for the end of October, there are fears that these protests
through Borneo. There are plenty further north. Before in much of Indonesia. Now the picture of that, late winter, I suppose you probably could have New South Wales. Tasmania with that low drifting south as well, staying in the Tasman Sea, not even reaching New Zealand. And the picture on Sunday is a better one for a place like Sydney. We're at 20 degrees again, about the average, but an increasingly breezy and wet picture, at least for South Australia and Victoria. As I said, New Zealand's doing quite well. You've got a couple of nice dry days with relative warmth. Relative.
On counting the cost, how powerful banking and political plans destroyed Lebanon's economy. Gas power plant.
back. You're watching Al Jazeera. Your top stories so far this half hour. Iran will be able to start buying conventional weapons again in October after the UN Security Council overwhelmingly rejected Washington's bid to indefinitely extend an arms embargo on Tehran. The funeral for a man killed during protests in Belarus is due to take place in Minsk shortly. Crowds are gathering at the site of his death for another day of demonstrations against the disputed presidential election. And the opposition in Ivory Coast is one says a new constitution does allow him to run again. Japan's emperor has expressed deep remorse in the past. It's marking World War II. Emperor Naruhito hopes the tragedy will never be repeated. But there was no apology from the Prime Minister, who thanked Richardson is an expert. She says Prime Minister, in fact, Japan's security
has they did have conflicts with there are still some ongoing issues. Some of the victims, especially in China and South Korea, the countries that bore the brunt of Japanese imperialism are still pursuing their own justice for quite a long has been pursuing more leeway in its defense and security policy. A lot of officials believe that peace it was signed in the context, it was kind of enforced upon Japan by the occupying US forces, and sort of enacted well, almost immediately after that, the Cold War broke out, and the US and Japan signed independence. So almost even by that stage, the peace constitution has made his primary objective is to very difficult process, but I think his political legacy will be that he has changed the status quo of Japan's security policy by finding ways to work around it.
India has seen another record in daily coronavirus infections. It confirmed more than 65,000 cases. Despite that, the Prime Minister praised the country's handling of the outbreak. Narendra Modi said almost $1.5 trillion would be injected into infrastructure projects to boost the economy. He made the announcement during a ceremony celebrating India's Independence Day, which marks the end of British colonial rule.
Self-reliant India.
The Colombian economy has suffered its worst slump on record.
It's the end of the line for the boys' hair salon. Until have promised government assistance, left them with no other option but to close its doors.
Íbamos súper bien. We were doing very well. I sold a car.
Like many other countries, the pandemic has taken a heavy toll on Colombia, but it's hitting particularly hard in a country to enter into the middle class.
We are facing the deepest and strongest recession that we have in the history of Colombia. With the data that we're getting basically on economic activity and the size of the closures end up having unemployed in terms of firms that are just closing down. This is something that has never happened in the country before.
Many shops that have reopened are struggling to get back into gear. In normal times, this mall would be teeming with people at this time of the day, but as you can see, there's been many here and open, like Iván Ospina. Raised in a low-income family, through hard work, he was able to open a successful restaurant in an up-and-coming neighborhood of Bogotá. With the pandemic, he has reduced his staff from 16 to but he's pessimistic.
I fear the country will go back to the 80s, and we're seeing it already with the streets emptied out and colonized by the poor. It's showing us how fragile our new middle class really is. This pandemic arrived and it's destroying it. A lot of people are falling through the cracks.
The government has announced a series of measures to deal with the crisis, pumping billions into the country's central bank and promising debt relief and economic assistance. But for many, it has already been too little too late to keep the lights on. Alessandro Ampietti, Al Jazeera, Bogotá.
For the first time in 6 months, passengers from mainland China are being vaccinating its coronavirus. Travel restrictions, it is a much-needed boost to its flagship carrier, Cathay Pacific. On Wednesday, the airline reported a loss of more than $1 billion Adrian Brown has more now from Hong Kong.
I'm in Hong Kong airport. There have been picture metaphors during this crisis over the past 6 months, and this is another one of them. As you can see, it's like a and remember, this is one of the world's busiest international airports. Well, things have eased a little bit on Saturday, as you write. Passengers arriving from mainland China are now able to transit in Hong Kong for up to 24 hours, although they can't leave the Hong Kong. Well, university students in China who have to get back to Europe and North America for the start of the university year. There simply aren't enough flights in China because of the restrictions on schedules to help them. So the mainland authorities have turned to Hong Kong, where from here, of course, you can still Cathay Pacific, that's no doubt. And this week, CX posted a half-year loss of more than $1.3 billion. In fact, passenger traffic on Cathay Pacific has dropped by more than 99% compared to this time a year ago. Cathay, of course, not the only airline in trouble. Airlines around the world are also suffering a similar fate right now.
Protesters in Congo, but the leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, says he won't trust the findings of such an inquiry.
تحقيق مش أنا بعمل تحقيق.
Hezbollah will not be conducting an investigation or making accusations. We will wait for the official Lebanese investigation. But if to reach anything, if Lebanon accepts an international investigation, the first objective of such investigation will involve Israel from Iran's foreign minister has criticized Western countries for demanding political change in Lebanon as a condition. As attention turns to recovery and reconstruction in the aftermath of the explosion, here's Stephanie Decker.
With more than 700 soldiers docks in Beirut's shattered port, here to help rebuild a broken city. There are future challenges of reconstruction, but there are also challenges on the political side. A government capable of taking courageous decisions will be necessary. And finally, there are also economic challenges. To get out of this crisis, major reforms will be needed. France's defense minister went on to meet the Lebanese leadership. The French have taken a leading role here in the aftermath of the catastrophic explosion. And here at the same time, the U.S. Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, together with the U.S. Ambassador to Lebanon. Here too, government.
of Lebanon to impose their conditions.
But many here don't see their presence that way.
Taking advantage of this catastrophic event that happened in Beirut a week ago or 10 days ago in order to leverage their position in Lebanon and in the region as well to advance their political interests. I think they are too much influential in setting up the political agenda in the country because, you know, the country's political...
The people of Beirut are having to come to terms of what's happened to their city, what's happened to their homes, and for those who've lost everything, just having to get through the day like many.
Mozambique's president has promised to create jobs. Mozambique's army is still trying to regain control of this gas-rich area. It's been captured by armed groups 3 times this year. Also, which has warned it might not be able to deal with the large numbers of mail-in ballots in the elections in November. Postmaster General Louis DeJoy denies allegations of intentionally slowing down the postal service. There's expected to be a huge rise in mail-in voting as a result of the pandemic. President Trump has tried to restrict the method because he claims it's susceptible to fraud. Mike Hanna is in Washington.
Last week, Democrats in Congress wrote a letter to the Inspector General asking him to take a look at the situation within the Postal Service. Now, that has been done. There's been delays of up to a week in postage, and this all follows that this investigation who has fired a number of people in key positions. He's reassigned others, so certainly it office. Now, looking ahead as well, of course, it's going to play a key role in terms of mail-in votes for the November election, given the ongoing pandemic. But in July, the Postal Service sent a letter to 46 states and could get them in time for the deadline in voting. So this is and within the Postal Service, particularly one that may be eligible.
Security Council overwhelmingly rated Washington. The cargo on 4 tankers amounts to more than 1 million barrels of petrol, its biggest ever seizure. Iran's denied any connection with the shipment. Both Iran and Venezuela are under U.S. sanctions. The funeral of a man killed during protests in Belarus is taking place in Minsk. Crowds are gathering at the site of his death against the disputed presidential election. Steph Vassen is there among the protesters.
Thousands of people have gathered here in the last hour for the memorial of the 34-year-old man, Alexander Taraikovsky, who was killed here a couple of nights ago. Protest. A mountain of flowers is here behind me. People are bringing in flowers from everywhere, and they are also, they held a minute, cars are passing by, maybe even in a row.
The opposition in Ivory Coast is promising more protests against the president's decision to seek a The Japanese emperor has expressed deep remorse over his country's wartime past on the 75th anniversary of Japan's World War II surrender. India has confirmed a new daily record for coronavirus infections during Independence Day speech. Injected into infrastructure projects to boost the economy. More news in 30 minutes. Counting the Cost is next.
Al Jazeera, wherever you are.
Hello. Your look at the world of business. Lebanon's economy. While people can't get access to their bank accounts, billions have been moved out of the country. Are opposed to the move. And the case. Nigeria goes. And as the current by blocking reforms and restricting access to money. Ordinary citizens can't get hold of their money. And are limited to taking out just $200 in place to make sure money doesn't leave the country. $6 billion has been smuggled out. Astonishingly, it's estimated $6 billion could seep out of the country while the International Monetary Fund is in talks recapitalize. That would mean wiping out the shareholders of local oligarchs. Unsurprisingly, they're not interested in that and are holding up any agreement. Well, much of them has been put on the bank, which is a currency linked to the dollar convinced many that the country was a stable place to invest. As money was sucked in, the bank loaned it out to the government to pay for imports, and it was good for dollars in dividends to shareholders. By 2019, half of the government's fiscal revenues Middle East Center. Mohammed, sir, how did the conflict of interest between the banks and the politicians first unfold? How did it start?
It unfolded during the 19th system in which you had different sects, leaders sharing power. After that, we had a banking sector which was divided along the same fault line, along the same confessional lines, and so the business leaders and also the politicians became partners. And as the government started taking more and more loans to fund the reconstruction of the country, based on the premise that, you know, one left by a hefty sum, and that, you know, by being very well positioned with country could actually, you know, face the increased competition brought in by an agreement, a peace agreement with Israel. That was the premise under which these massive construction projects were undertaken. But also we've seen an increase. Yes.
So where was the regulator in all of this? What was the central bank doing?
It was entangled.
with the banking sector. I mean, the regulator is not really a regulator, it's a partner of the banking sector. I mean, now we're regulator. What we call in Lebanon, هندسة الميل. That happened between the banks and which they made billions of dollars of profit in a split second, and you know how some of that money was being transferred one way or the other, and abroad. The extent of the dealings between, for instance, one bank, Bank Audi, and the central bank's governor. So they were in bed, just specifically as much as the politicians were in bed with the bank. Have board of directors, etc. You know, the same thing with there were dealings, there were he was the banking sector.
And some people, analysts, economists, have even accused the central bank of running a Ponzi scheme.
I think the banking sector turned into a massive marketing machine. I mean, it employed thousands of people. You can see them looking like salespeople, like you know, the Lebanese. Lebanese expats abroad and asking them to bring their money in. I mean, you would be surprised to learn you know, to what extent they went to get some of that money. They had representatives across the world. They were meeting. Lebanese expats, offering them all kinds of interest packages, and attracting all of that money to give it directly to the Lebanese government. recklessly without any plan of how that money would be paid. Yes, there is. Signs of one, and it is one.
So, hold up.
Yes, I mean now the political class will undergo some serious reforms, and it will go to the IMF. But the package will in no way reach to help the bank. This is not possible. Some sort of a haircut is needed, whether it's a direct haircut or it's an indirect one, like the one we're witnessing now, in which you can't really take your deposits. You would take them in Lebanese pounds at a discounted price, given the inflation and given the appreciation of the Lebanese pounds. So this is now the the status quo. Depositors will lose much of their money, and Lebanon will get a small package from the IMF. The old order, in which high government spending was used for political reasons, will no longer be.
Okay,
this is the reality of things.
Let's quickly talk about one other route, because Lebanon has gold reserves estimated to be in excess of something like $16 billion. Could that perhaps provide a financial lifeline?
I doubt it would provide a financial lifeline, given that Lebanon's external debt is nearly $30 billion. And if this is a lifeline, it would be used either to pay some of that external debt, or to be have been discussed by this political class, and there's only one seeking external help and also doing a haircut and changing the economic system internally. Everyone now is talking about more productivity, shifting away from high government spending, etc. So all of these options are on the table. They just need to do them, and I think this is an existential crisis for the current political order.
Mohamed, let me get a final thought. Forward, step up to play.
Given how the confessional system works, given the regional competition, there's also some external help and funding provided to the political class, whether from Iran or whether from the Gulf region, etc. I think this will be a slow process, but it will happen, given that we've shifted from an economic order which allows these politicians to sustain themselves for many years into a new economic order, which will see a different private sector. That will have its own implications on the political class.
Mohamed Haj Ali, thank you very much for your thoughts here on Counting the Cost. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Now, the battle to decide who will control the Washington-based Inter-American Development Bank has split Latin America and become a bitter issue. The reason is the White House's decision to field an American candidate to run Latin America's principal development bank. Lucia Newman explains from Santiago.
It's called the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, a kind of distant cousin of the IMF. When it was founded in 1959, former U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower promised it would always be led by a Latin American. And it always has. But now, just as Latin America is projected to suffer the worst economic impact from the pandemic of any region in the world, the White House is fielding a candidate to lead the region's most important development institution. And the battle is on.
It is a surprise. It breaks a tradition. And we in Chile, former finance and foreign ministers, signed a letter, very respectfully, I must say this, very respectfully saying that we are asking for the election to be postponed, to have a time to discuss.
Larraín, a possible candidate himself, is not alone. President Donald Trump has picked hardline advisor Mauricio Claver Carone as his choice to control the IDB. One reason for the sudden interest, according to U.S. government sources, is to far more qualified professionals in the region than Claver Carone are in fact demanding the election be postponed until after the U.S. election. But many countries are under pressure from Washington.
So the fact that the U.S. should try to impose their candidate on the rest of the hemisphere does not seem to me to be a good precedent.
Well, do you think that
Belize, I am somehow inclined to think he would not be a strong candidate to lead the IDB.
For decades, the bank has played a key role in a region that has little access to international capital markets. It finances infrastructure and social development projects, which will now be more vital than ever. The U.S. candidate argues the United States wants to play a bigger role in the region, and that it's time to break with tradition and modernize the IDB.
If the way of modernizing the IDB is to run the IDB like the United States, one of the highest rates of contagion in the world.
Until now, the bank has widespread respect. This time round, Lucia Newman
for not sticking to British Virgin and use the company. The case has drawn a great deal of interest from advocacy groups that claim investors can extract billions even from failed investments. So let's talk to Kawar Qureshi, QC, head of McNair Chambers. He joins us via Skype from London. Kawar, so why did this award go against Nigeria? I mean, it seems unfair, given that the Irish company didn't even put a spade in the ground, but they claim to have spent $40 million just on design.
So far as this particular case is concerned, from what I can glean, there are public documents, including a judgment of the High Court. The claimant's position is very simply this. A contract was entered into in 2010, as you've just summarized. It was breached by Nigeria in 2012. There was a protracted arbitration process which led to a finding of liability against Nigeria that they breached the contract. And then subsequently, it's being suggested that Nigeria didn't do enough to contest the next phase, which is the damages phase, leading to that substantial award that you've just mentioned. And I ought to add that in my 30 years of experience in practice as a barrister, I've acted for or against nearly 60 states. Such sums are not unusual. They're substantial, but I'm afraid awards against states of hundreds of millions of dollars are not uncommon.
Under the circumstances, Kawar, could the court set aside the award or even overturn it?
Arbitration is a process that's been agreed to very often by states in commercial contracts, and the assumption, quite often the wrong assumption, is that the state has undertaken effective due diligence, legal review, and due diligence, commercial due diligence of the counterparty. That seems not to be often the case. However, when it comes to the award of the arbitrators, the perceived virtue of arbitration is that it's not like a court process. Arbitral awards, thanks to a convention of 1958, are subject to very limited grounds of challenge when they're taken to states for enforcement. And the ground that I understand, to establish that, they would need fairly strong evidence for the English court to conclude that that was in fact the case. If they were able to establish that, then the English court would not countenance enforcement.
And could the company seek to perhaps seize assets in the United States? How would that work, for instance?
Ordinarily, once an arbitral award has been issued, there is a limited period of time for that award to be challenged. In this case, Nigeria sought to challenge out of time and sought to deploy evidence that they contended wasn't available from seeking to enforce the award wherever Nigeria has commercial assets. So they could go against the physical assets, property, or they could lay their hands on, which isn't encumbered.
Or New York, and is that fair to developing nations?
ultimately, as I mentioned to at the outset, it's open to a state to try and negotiate a contract with the foreign investor. And there are some states, because of their bargaining power, maybe because of their level of sophistication, that insist that if there's going to be a dispute, it must be before the local courts. But generally, commercial investors take the view, rightly or wrongly, that the local courts are unlikely to find against the state or an emanation of the state, that the process before the local courts may be lengthy, uncertain. Arbitration has the virtue of providing an award that's enforceable with very limited options available to the defendant. And London, New York have both been chosen because historically they've been a legal pool. It's easy to come and go from there. And the courts, certainly in England, have for decades signalled their support for the arbitration process as opposed to adopting a position of intervention, which unfortunately is seen to be the case in some jurisdictions, which are therefore unlikely to attract arbitration.
And Kawar, there's a growing trend in trade negotiations for nations to agree to pay the full value.
Ultimately, it's for the state to determine what it is prepared to agree to, and the optimum position for a state is to take proper advice, commercial advice, legal position. Having acted for lots of foreign investors, having acted for states, the foreign investor position is understandable. I've been invited in. I have spent money, however much it may be. I have a commercial expectation, a legitimate expectation that the state's undermined, and therefore I'm entitled to pursue a claim to finality and seek an award. I have to say, though, that in addition to arbitration, there is a framework which provides protection to investors through what are known as bilateral investment treaties, state to state. And some states have now started to denounce those treaties, particularly in South America, as well as renegotiate them, because they're taking the view that these are one-sided.
Kawar, just a final brief thought to you. I mean, people will look at other cases which have been dragged through the courts, for example, vulture funds in Argentina. Big losses, and there's always a get-out clause that sees them walking off with huge payments.
Even if there were such a perception, and even if it was well-founded, I come back to the main point that I raised at the outset. Investors are entering into jurisdictions or entering into contracts, and it's incumbent upon states to ensure that their interests are properly protected. But if there's a problem, that may well be one of the major areas that states need to address.
Kawar Qureshi, great to get your thoughts. Thank you very much. Territory to prevent illegal fishing by foreign boats. Countries across Latin America are concerned about Chinese ships entering their waters and depleting stocks. Teresa Bow reports from Buenos Aires.
Argentina escorted a Chinese fishing ship towards a port in Patagonia. It's an to control attempts by foreign vessels to fish illegally in Argentine waters.
801, stop and shine, sir. Stop and shine.
International ships are allowed to fish outside the economic exclusive zone, but in recent years, there's been a sharp increase in attempts to cross what is known as the Mile 200, where Argentine waters begin.
Our sea platform is one of the richest in the world. So far this
And other types of communication, Argentina can track ships violating its exclusive zone. This type of vessels are the ones that are used to patrol Argentina's exclusive zone. If a ship is found to be fishing illegally in those waters, then that ship can be captured and the owners have to pay a fine. This vessel, for example, has been involved in several operations, and it has the ships that it has captured in the past. It has the name, the date, and the country it belonged to. Most of them belong to China and then Spain. Even though there are many companies from different countries involved in illegal fishing, China has become a main concern. With an overseas fleet of over 16,000 ships, they pose a major threat to developing countries. Just recently, around 300 ships were located outside the Galapagos Island. Such fishing is not illegal because it takes place in international waters, but it can cause damage in one of the richest and biodiverse
to put pressure on countries like China.
But most nations do not want a conflict with China, leaving developing countries to defend their resources in whatever way they can. Teresa Bo, Al Jazeera, Buenos Aires.
And that is our show for this week. But remember, you can get in touch with us via Twitter. Use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. Or you can drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. But there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Darren Jordan from the whole team here. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.
A global pandemic. Join me, Steve Clements, in conversation with leading voices on the bottom line. Your weekly take on U.S. politics and society on Al Jazeera.
For 4 weeks, America engulfed in protest. Every day, all over the U.S. The continued threat of a deadly pandemic. And it morphed. Sometimes it was violent, but mostly it was peaceful.
I think people want change, and I think people are willing to.
On Friday, millions of people in America are expected to celebrate what's called Juneteenth, an unofficial holiday commemorating the end of slavery in the United States. This year, in the wake of the nationwide protests, there is a growing number of calls to make it an official federal holiday.
As people see it as a great opportunity to take to the streets to continue to let their message be heard.
Frank assessments.
What are you seeing there in Yemen?
76% of the total population are facing life-threatening shortage of food.
Informed opinions.
Is Ethiopia on the verge of breakdown?
Many parts of the Oromia region are actually under a de facto state of emergency.
Critical debate.
After he is a proxy, he does not represent the interest of the Libyan people.
In-depth analysis of the day's global headlines. Inside Story on Al Jazeera.
Every generation has a higher purpose. Ours is to stay home.
Nastasia Tay, and this is the News Hour live from our headquarters here in Doha. Coming up in the next 60 minutes. The demands for political change echo around the Belarusian capital. Thousands gather to remember a man killed during embargo on Iran. Tehran being a big concern and expressing deep remorse. Japan pledges never to repeat the tragedy of conflict as it marks 75 years since the end of the Second World War. I'm Joanna Gajrowska with the sports, including Barcelona booed after their biggest loss in Europe as Bayern Munich thrashed them 8-2 in the Champions League quarter-finals. Thousands have come out in the as the funeral is held for a man who was killed during election protests earlier this week. And just in the past hour, President Lukashenko has made it very clear that he does not intend to step. Alexander Tarakovsky was killed. His funeral is being held just a short distance away. Regular chants of leave aimed at Lukashenko have echoed around that square. And opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who is currently in Lithuania, has called for people to come out across the country this weekend. Reports from Minsk.
Protesters came out in large numbers Friday. They were joined by workers to protest against the Lukashenko regime.
We can't stand the situation anymore. People are afraid, but there will be more. We have more people, and our factory has many more workers.
They have come out of their factory and are now heading to the city center. They're protesting not only against the police crackdown, but also against what they call our rigged elections. These are very unusual scenes in Belarus.
But suddenly one soldier drops his shield and then
Stay clear of the streets now. You have to understand that you and your children are being used like cannon fodder. People have already arrived from Poland, the Netherlands, Ukraine and Russia. From open Russia and Navalny and their salt. The aggression against our country has already started.
Detainees who were released talked about torture. Tens had to be taken to a hospital immediately after their release. Others were treated by volunteers who came to the detention centers to help.
Fractures, bruises, dislocations, brain injuries, nose fractures, abrasions, hematoma, hemorrhage to brain and even to eyes. It's a nightmare. Fascists don't even do these things.
While the government has tried to appease protesters by releasing detainees, the wounds on their bodies appear to have had the opposite effect. Throughout the evening, crowds at the Independence Square started swelling, their festive and fiery mood in sharp contrast with the threatening words of Lukashenko and his armed soldiers standing nearby. Step Fasen, Al Jazeera, Minsk.
Well, we can now speak to our correspondent, Step Vasson. She is amongst the protesters out on the streets of Minsk right now. Step, people there are currently paying their respects to Alexander Tarakovsky, but this is clearly also an expression of defiance.
I can't hear you very well. I'm here amongst tens of thousands of protesters who have come out to a memorial for Alexander Tarakovsky, a 34-year-old man who was killed at the protest earlier in the week. But this memorial has grown to a large mass gathering. It's really a turning point here for Alexander Lukashenko. They are very determined and they're growing in numbers as I speak. They're screaming for him to leave. They call the police criminals. They are really, really determined and also defiant considering the police violence that they have been experiencing. This morning said that he wants to ask for the help of President Putin. I've been asking people here what that would mean for the protest, but they say they're still defiant. They are not going to stop. No threat is going to chase them away from the street any longer.
Stefan, apologies for the line. I know it's
difficult to say how much pressure also within the system is now on Lukashenko, but it's definitely there's a lot going on. Watching it also very carefully, what is happening here at his doorstep. People here are not interested in geopolitical reality. That Belarus is in the middle of Europe and also as a buffer zone between Russia and the European Union. They are now interested in their own future, and that's what they are also screaming here. This is our country. They basically just simply want their country back.
Step, you talked about how the atmosphere there seems to have changed over the last few days. We saw members of the police hugging protesters yesterday. And with more protests planned, are we now beginning to see cracks in the security services and the government there?
It started yesterday, soldiers lowering their shields, being hugged by women. Also, people throwing away their uniforms and the military also happening in the last couple of days. But the key question, of course, is how the highest ranking officers, generals, are now looking at the situation. Everyone, of course, is calculating where this is going to go. Nobody can tell us that. But definitely they're looking at it, and they will, at one stage, have to make a decision if they're still backing Lukashenko, who really in detention centers in the last week. So they will definitely calculate where this is going to go, and then we might see some movement.
Step Vasson, our correspondent on the ground for us in the Belarusian capital, Minsk. Thank you very much, Step. Well, if you're just joining us, to remind you, we are watching these thousands and thousands of people, these live pictures of a memorial service for Alexander Tarakovsky. His funeral's being after Sunday's disputed presidential election. We've seen thousands repeatedly out on the streets every night, and we also saw a brutal police crackdown. A lot of the people have now come out in protest of that crackdown as well. Let's take a listen. There are chants for opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who's currently in Lithuania, has called for more people to come out over the weekend, so we do expect to see more scenes like this over the course of the next few days. We'll be covering that for you here on Al Jazeera. Well, now moving to protesters in Lebanon, where they've been calling for an independent international investigation into the Beirut port blast that killed more than 200 people 2 weeks ago. But the leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, says he wouldn't trust the findings of such an inquiry.
But if the FBI is participating in Israel is related to the attack, you will not be able to reach anything. If Lebanon accepts an international investigation, the first objective of such investigation will be to absolve Israel from any responsibility for the explosion, if it is responsible.
Well, Iran's foreign minister has criticized Western countries for demanding political change in Lebanon as a condition for providing financial aid to the country. Jabhat Zarif was the latest high-profile figure to visit Beirut, as attention now turns to recovery and reconstruction. Stephanie Decker reports.
A French Navy ship with more than 700 soldiers docks in Beirut's shattered port, here to help rebuild a
challenges, and there will be future challenges of reconstruction. But there are also challenges on the political side. A government capable of taking courageous decisions will be necessary. And finally, there are also economic challenges. To get out of this crisis, major reforms will be needed.
France's defense minister went on to meet the Lebanese leadership. The French have taken a leading role here in the aftermath of the catastrophic explosion. And here at the same time, the US Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, together with the US, his opinion on who should choose Lebanon's next government.
Countries should not abuse the tragic need and situation of Lebanon to impose their conditions.
But many here don't see their presence that way.
I think these foreign powers are taking advantage of this catastrophic event that happened in Beirut a week ago or 10 days ago in order to leverage their position in Lebanon and in the region as well to advance their political interests. I think they are too much influential in setting up the political agenda in the country because, the country's political faction are interrelated, or they have very good relationship with these foreign powers.
And as diplomats negotiate what the next government will look like, the people of Beirut are having to come to terms with what's happened to their city, what's happened to their homes, and for those who've lost everything, just having to get through the day. It's volunteers that are doing most of the work here. Any official help is notably absent. And whatever the next government may look like, many people will tell you nothing will change, and justice for all of this will never come. Stephanie Decker, Al Jazeera, Beirut.
Well, let's get a live update now from Bernard Smith, who's also in Beirut. Bernard, when we spoke in those first few days after this blast, with people trying to put their homes back together, and any kind of help from the government was then conspicuously
absent. What are in its place? NGOs such as the one I'm standing next to, Médecins Sans Frontières, they've set up a COVID testing station here. There's been a spike of COVID cases in Lebanon since the explosion, 7,700 active cases since Friday, according to the World Health Organization. There's other facilities being made available at this clinic, chronic health conditions being given medication, people asking for all sorts of things, nappies, baby formula, which they can't offer here, and around all the shells of those buildings hit by the blast. $1 million in priorities the UN and its partners say immediate provisions of hot food, rations and grain. That's something that they need funding for, and families that will also be given cash to pay for shelter. There were friends or cousins, relatives elsewhere in the country, some by neighbours. Some have been given free accommodation. It won't last forever, so they'll be given funding to help try and cover the costs while their own homes are restored. Many of the homes, particularly some of Lebanon's older buildings, will need to be destroyed. About 60 heritage buildings, according to UNESCO, are under threat from collapsing. And as soon as that first phase of recovery is over, the UN says they want to move as quickly as possible to phase 2, which is recovery and reconstruction. And that's where Lebanon needs that foreign funding to come in to help rebuilding. Maybe as much as $30 billion needed to rebuild this city.
Bernard Smith there, our correspondent on the ground in Beirut. Thank you very much, Bernard. Well, as Bernard was saying, much of the focus in Lebanon is now on rebuilding both the damaged. Estimated costs of recovery in Beirut go as high as $15 billion. The UN says 6 hospitals, 20 clinics and 120 schools were also damaged. Lebanon was already under serious economic strain before the blast. Inflation was soaring, the cost of basic goods was rising, and now its health system is facing added pressure at a time of a global pandemic. The UN says half of the COVID-19 infections in the country were diagnosed just in the past 2 weeks alone. Well, let's now speak to Najat Rushdie. She's the UN resident and humanitarian coordinator for Lebanon. She joins us now on Skype from Beirut. Najat, I know this is a very busy time. Thank you for being with us. It's now been more than 10 days since the...
Well, thank you very much. We came up with the emergency priorities, which is related to the life-saving humanitarian relief protection as a cross-cutting issue. A lot of focus was, of course, on the health system because of what you already said, some very important health services to treat actually the injured, and you know that there has been more than 6,000 injured in this blast. That was our objective now and our focus now, moving from the life-saving humanitarian relief to some kind of early recovery and starting rehabilitating damaged health facilities, trauma kits, and essential medication. Because, for example, because of the explosion of the port, a lot of the chronic disease medicine were also completely destroyed. So it's a way actually to prepare the ground for more social and economic recovery and for reconstruction. And we are starting already, thinking about that and asking for funding about that, which is actually compounded in the appeal assistance to stay forever. And we would like to make sure the Lebanese people go back on their feet.
Najat, I do want to get to reconstruction in just a moment, but before that, I do want to ask, Bernard's been showing us around some of the damaged hospitals over the last few days, and you talked about the damage to health facilities that we've seen. We are now hearing about this potential second wave of COVID, that this huge spike in cases that we've seen over the last 2 weeks. How do you even begin to try to tackle something like that when there is no infrastructure?
We have never stopped actually addressing that, and there are now a number of mobile units which actually are twinning with the hospitals to treat and address the COVID cases. I mean, it's not a surprise that the numbers are increasing, because of course a lot of the precautionary the precaution that were there before were completely gone during the day of the blast and the following days. People were really coming and crowded places in hospitals. People were looking for their loved ones, and in those circumstances it's very difficult to respect emergency response. That was part of the initial response last week. This week we have been really helping and supporting, besides some of the bilateral aid that the government got through bilateral cooperation, and scaling up the capacity of the mobile unit to address COVID-19. We don't need that on top of all the crises. You mentioned the social crisis, you mentioned the economic crisis. The blast obviously is leading to a real and very serious and tragic humanitarian crisis. So we need absolutely not to forget that COVID-19 is still a very important threat here in Lebanon.
Sure. Najat, as Bernard referred to earlier, your plan, I believe, is broken down into a number of different phases. So the first one right now, which we're seeing, the humanitarian phase, and the second one on reconstruction. There have been a huge number of red flags raised over the transparency of that aid rollout, the potential corruption there. How do you plan to tackle that? Is there a plan in place?
Well, we have somehow, in the phase one, we have two components. There is the life-saving humanitarian relief, and that was last week. And we started this week really putting together all what is needed for the early recovery. For the reconstruction, there are a number of structural actually issues that we need to address, which are not only related actually to the impact of the blast, but also some gaps in terms of infrastructure, in terms of social services. You address, of course, the governance issue, which is related to corruption, but also a number of reforms related to financial system. We have started working with the World Bank and with the European Union. This is part of a tripartite agreement we have between the three institutions to come up with a post-disaster and a social cohesion kind of assistance assessment. There is an ongoing damage needs assessment, and we should be able to have a clear idea about the needs by 20th of August. Based on that, there will be prioritization of the different reconstruction, restoration. There will be a mix between reconstruction and restoration, but we are not talking only about the reconstruction, the physical reconstruction of the infrastructure. It's also related to social protection, social safety net, to access to electricity, to access to water, to access to health. So there is a lot that needs to be addressed, and obviously, while at the working level, we are also working with some of the ministries, at least those who are involved. It is very much an independent assessment that is going on.
Right. Nadal Broshti there, the UN resident and humanitarian coordinator for Lebanon. We do wish you all the best with the humanitarian situation and what's to follow. Thank you very much for being with us here on Al Jazeera.
Thank you very much.
Well, there is plenty more ahead for you on this news hour, including the violent demonstrations in Ivory Coast to protest the president's decision to seek a third term. And in sport, Mercedes set the pace ahead of the Formula One Spanish Grand Prix. That's coming up. Now, Iran will be able to start buying conventional weapons again in October after the US failed to get a 13-year ban extended. Just one other nation backed it in a vote at the UN Security Council. Iran says the US has never been so isolated, but the White House is threatening to find other ways to bring back sanctions. From New York, Kristen Salumi reports.
It was a quick and unceremonious end to the United States' efforts to extend the Iranian arms embargo.
The result of the voting is as follows: 2 votes in favor, 2 votes against, 11 as abstentions. The draft resolution has not been adopted, having failed to obtain the required number of votes.
In a statement, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo called it an inexcusable failure, saying, quote, "The Security Council paved the way for the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism to buy and sell conventional weapons without specific UN restrictions in place for the first time in over a decade." Under an agreement negotiated by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council and Germany aimed at stopping Iran from developing nuclear weapons, the 13-year-old ban on conventional weapons sales is due to expire in October. Russia and China, accusing the U.S. of undermining the deal, had threatened to veto the resolution, but didn't have to. The Dominican Republic was the only other country to vote for it.
Well, it's a diplomatic catastrophe. It just demonstrates that President Trump and his team are not only bad at the strategy of approaching Iran, they're bad at just the day-to-day tactics of diplomacy. It is unconscionable that they couldn't round up more than 1 vote for a resolution like this.
The U.S. has threatened to trigger the return of all international sanctions on Iran through a snapback provision written into the nuclear deal. But other members of the Security are them preventing Iran from getting a nuclear.
The U.S. has worked for humiliated. The reason 11 countries abstained and 2 voted against it is an achievement for Iran and a political failure for the U.S.
Well, let's speak to Afshin Shahi. He's a senior lecturer in Middle East politics in the Division of Peace Studies and International Development at the University of Bradford, and he joins us now from London. Afshin, the mechanism, which would have serious consequences for Tehran.
The Trump new scenario, as you mentioned it yourself about a couple of years ago, the United States, for a combination of reasons, the deal. And naturally, once you leave the deal, you no longer can benefit from its existing legal instrument. Over the last 5 or 6 months, the United States made actually this resolution its number 1 signature policy in the Middle East. I literally lost out of count of the number of trips Mr. Brian Hook made around the globe in order to persuade permanent or non-permanent members of the Security Council to kind of vote for it. But in the end, as we saw yesterday, only Dominican Republic was prepared to side with the US. Even Britain, which is still in search of a desirable post-Brexit deal with the US, decided to adopt a neutral position, which is quite telling and which is extremely embarrassing and humiliating for the United States. But given the fact that actually this defeat is so humiliating, I very much doubt that if Trump, just 4 months before the election, is going to basically give in and give up. And without any doubt, it's going to take new measures. And as they promised, they're going to use this kind of a snapback mechanism. But as I said, unfortunately, as I said, there are a lot of limitations. All the existing members of the deal have made it very clear that the U.S. no longer has the right to use that legal mechanism. But as I said, I very much doubt that if Trump is going to take no as an answer, and they're going to use the remaining 4 months to push further for it.
Well, the Europeans are really not thrilled about this, and they've been clear they want to save the nuclear deal. Tehran, though, has also been very critical of them, suggesting that they're not actually doing enough. I know Rouhani was even on the phone to Macron this week about it. Is this vote enough of a declaration of solidarity here to try to preserve the deal?
I don't think this is a declaration of solidarity with Tehran in any sense of the term. Even Britain made it very clear that they are still extremely concerned about Iranian foreign policy. They are extremely concerned about so many other issues that they probably agree with the United States when it comes to Iran. But Britain decided to side with its European allies, Berlin and Paris, and for them at the moment the most important objective, at least for the remaining 4 months of the Trump presidency, is basically preserving the deal with the hope that maybe if there is a new president in the White House in 4 or 5 months' time, they can kind of revitalize it again. Over the last, basically since 2008, the European powers more or less they maintain kind of their consistent message that they agree on so many other issues with the United States when it comes to Iranian missile program, when it comes to Iranian foreign policy in the region, when it comes to violation of human rights inside Iran. But when it comes to this specific issue, preservation of the deal, the Europeans seem to be kind of very consistent, and that has created a almost unprecedented kind of gap between Europe and the United States. In my opinion, basically this issue has been the single most important disagreement between Europe and Washington over the last 3 or 4 years.
Afshin Shahida, a senior lecturer at the University of Bradford. Great to get your insights and thoughts here on Al Jazeera. Thanks for being with us, Afshin. Well, it is now time for the weather, and Rob is going to tell us about all the monsoons we're seeing in East Asia.
Yes, the East Asian monsoon's still falling, of course, still raining, but the orientation has changed. So, if you look behind me in the satellite picture, it's this sort of angle we're looking at now. So, Chengdu's in line for the whitest cloud. Now, these are the headwaters of the Yangtze, blue, and you can see from it's coming there. It's fine for now. Now, the same sort of orientation does not change further west. The forecast for Chongqing, by the way, is fine for a couple of days. Then the rain gets in, but it's only light rain. So I say the for these obviously comes down through Bangladesh, and the forecast the next day or so is an onshore breeze. The rain's not as heavy. No, that's further west, more or less focused from the centre of that circulation in India, which is taking the rain, if you like, towards Rajasthan. And in the heart of that, the next couple of days is probably Bhopal, which has got 3 days of heavy rain or thunderstorms.
Thanks very much, Rob. Well, still ahead for you here on Al Jazeera. Failure to deliver by the US Postal Service is at the center of an investigation over the presidential election in November. And we'll tell you why Hong Kong has eased travel restrictions to allow transit flights from mainland China. And a world record is smashed in the first competitive athletics meet since the coronavirus shutdown. Joe will have all those details for you in sport.
It starts in poor rural communities with the promise of a prosperous marriage. But countless young Indian women find themselves duped, commodified. Slavery, a 21st century evil, continues with bridal slaves on Al Jazeera. Investigative journalism.
I've got my ID. Look, this is my ID. I'm from the press.
Global experts in discussion
Should reparations be paid?
The conversation is about anti-colonialism. It's about the freedom of the people of this region.
Giving voice to the voiceless.
It's like you're going to the war zone every time you work.
Programs that open your eyes to an alternative view of the world today on Al Jazeera.
In Doha. Let's remind you of our top stories here this hour. Thousands of people have gathered in Minsk for a new day of protest for the presidential election. The continued demands for political change come as buying conventional weapons again in October after the UN overwhelmingly rejected an indefinitely extended arms embargo on Tehran. The United Nations has launched an over $500 million aid appeal to help with port explosion recovery efforts in Beirut. Lebanon was already under severe economic strain before the blast. Now turning to the coronavirus pandemic, and Russia says it's begun manufacturing its new vaccine for COVID-19, and initial batches will be rolled out within 2 weeks. Doctors will be the first to be immunized before the general public. The Gamaleya Institute, which has developed the drug, says it will produce 5 million doses by December. Russia's coronavirus vaccine, said to be the first to be approved in the wild, is raising concerns about safety. And now British tourists have been scrambling to return home after the UK imposed a 14-day quarantine for travellers coming from the Netherlands, Malta and France. That measure, which went into effect early on Saturday, was introduced after a surge in coronavirus infections in those countries. Well, France is a popular vacation spot for UK holidaymakers. It's the second most visited country after Spain. Our correspondent Rory Challens joins us now from London's St Pancras International Train Station. Rory, so many Brits were in France this week. Do we know how many made it back in time?
It's difficult to put exact figures on it. Certainly we know that maybe about 500,000 Brits are affected in total, perhaps 160,000 on holiday in France this week. How many of them made it back? Not sure for certain. Certainly in the tens of thousands, we would have thought have made that last minute plan change to get back home. They were given little over 24 hours, perhaps 30 hours by the British government. A lot of people very angry at that short notice. Changing their plans, booking train tickets, booking ferry tickets, booking plane tickets, expensive alterations to holidays, cut in some cases very short indeed. Accounts in the media at the moment of people who literally just arrived in France, had to turn around and come back again with their families as well. Accounts of people on ferries which were due to dock at just a few minutes to the deadline of 03 GMT this morning. Would they make it back in time? What constituted as being back home? Did the boat actually have to dock? Was it just in UK waters? Apparently it does have to dock and be actually properly moored to a jetty to constitute being back home. But yeah, a lot of anger I think in the country at the moment. The government gave so many people so little time to make very expensive changes to their holidays.
And Rory, we saw something similar happen with Spain. I mean, what happens to the people who miss this deadline?
Well, if you're coming back now, and the people who maybe milling around in the backgrounds coming out of the international train station, they've missed the deadline, so they will have to self-quarantine for 14 days. Now, that can have big impacts on people's lives. I mean, going on holiday is not a God-given right. So employers have been saying to their employees, well, if you've missed that deadline, then I'm afraid your quarantine perhaps is going to have to be unpaid leave. There's also the question of what happens to families coming back, having to quarantine with the start of school just couple of weeks away. So if you're coming back in a few days' time and you have to quarantine for 14 days, then some children inevitably are going to be missing the start of the school year. And considering that much of the last academic year was completely disrupted, that's obviously going to have an impact on education, etc. So yeah, this is going to be something that affects people's lives. Again, cost impacts on people's wallets and how they go about their day-to-day lives.
Rory Tallon's there live for us in King's Cross in London. Thank you very much, Rory. Well, Peru is one of Latin America's worst hit countries. The health system has been pushed close to breaking point as coronavirus cases there have soared. Now, doctors at the National Children's Hospital are raising the alarm over a small-scale but worrying new outbreak. John Holman reports.
At the National Children's Hospital, while there's still very few of the seriously ill that are this young,
the intensive care unit.
Dr. Franklin Mendoza blames it on one thing.
El comportamiento social y la cultura, parents' behavior, leaving children to play to the park, or visiting shopping malls or family visits. That's what's leading the increase in infections among children.
Serious COVID cases among children are still very far from widespread, and most of those here already had other medical complications. As in other countries, the virus's effect on children has differed from the symptoms shown by older sufferers.
It's not the same as the adult infection, which causes lack of breath. After about a month, they've been developing pediatric inflammatory multisystem syndrome, which affects several organs, especially their hearts.
The staff are doing their best to help them, learning new techniques as they go. It's tough for them too.
It's really painful having to submit a little one to intubation or a ventilator, but we know we have to do it, because if not, the patient could die.
And scenes like this make it worth it.
I'm so grateful to you for taking care of my baby. I want to thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. God bless you all.
The team here are hoping that this sudden increase in cases doesn't go on, and that there will be more patients.
Dog is in postmaster. There's expected to be a huge rise susceptible to fraud. Well, now, for the first time in 6 months, passengers from mainland China are being allowed to transit through Hong Kong's international airport. The city is gradually relaxing its coronavirus travel restrictions. It's a much-needed boost to its flagship carrier, Cathay Pacific. On Wednesday, the airline reported a loss of more than $1 billion. Now, Japan's emperor has expressed deep remorse for his country's wartime past. It's marking 75 years since it surrendered to Allied forces, effectively ending World War II. Emperor Naruhito hopes the tragedy will never be repeated. But there was no apology from Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who thanked the war's dead for their sacrifices. He avoided a personal visit to a controversial shrine which has caused division between Japan, China and South Korea. Lauren Richardson is an expert on the region. She says Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has changed Japan's security policy.
Japan has made a lot of apologies, they've also paid reparations, and to normalise their relations with many of the countries that they did have conflicts with. There are still some ongoing issues. Some of the victims, especially in China and South Korea, the countries that bore the brunt of Japanese imperialism, are still pursuing their own forms of justice. For quite a long time, the Conservative Party in Japan, the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, has been pursuing more leeway in its defence and security policy. A lot of officials believe that peace constitution is quite outdated because it was signed in the context, it was kind of enforced upon Japan by the occupying US forces, and it was sort of enacted in the context of the immediate post-war when the US wished to demilitarize Japan. But now that, well, almost immediately after that, the Cold War broke out and the US and Japan signed an alliance. So almost even by that stage, the peace constitution was sort of hitting a kind of expiry date. And certainly Prime Minister Abe has made it his I guess, his primary objective is to maybe change that peace constitution, and he hasn't managed to change it. It's a very difficult process, but I think his political legacy will be that he has changed the status quo of Japan's security policy by finding ways to work around it.
Now, the opposition in Ivory Coast is warning of more protests to denounce the president's decision to seek a third term. Another day of demonstrations on Friday turned violent. Protesters accuse Alassane Ouattara of breaking a two-term limit, but he insists a new constitution allows him to run again. Ahmed Idris reports.
This is what remains of a police station in the southeastern town of Bonwa, as opposition supporters clash with security forces. It's the latest in a series of demonstrations taking place across Ivory Coast for a third consecutive day. The protests threaten to plunge the country, once an island of stability, into its biggest political crisis since the Civil War of 2010. The contention is a declaration by President Alassane Ouattara to run again.
We are protesting for the President Ouattara to go because the constitution has been violated, and we don't want to accept a third term. We call on the entire population of Ivory Coast to join us in making Ouattara leave.
In a broadcast last week, the president announced his campaign.